Negotiating your ERP or HCM software and implementation contract is one of the most important things you can do. It can have the biggest cost savings or cost escalation depending on how you negotiate it for your long-term project. Yet so many organizations fail to handle this important aspect of their digital transformation well. I'm going to talk about what you can do to negotiate a better contract for your organization in today's video. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys, and we often help our clients negotiate contracts. And this is one of the challenges that organizations face is they are headed into their implementation. They've selected the software that they're very excited about. Momentum generally is as high as it's ever going to get during a transformation during the negotiation phase. Typically, we have a vision and a clear path for how things could improve and how the new software is going to make our business better. So there's just a lot of excitement and momentum behind the project. But it causes companies to overlook some important details and important risks that they need to recognize and mitigate and negotiate as part of their negotiation process. And I want to provide some tips today on what you can do to negotiate a better contract for your organization. So first, it helps to recognize why vendor negotiations is so important. I think we all recognize on the surface that negotiating a favorable contract is important. It's always been important, but it's especially important in today's day and age. What I mean by that is we've always had the issue of potential cost savings or spending too much on software if we didn't negotiate the right kind of deal. And during the world of on-premise ERP systems, a lot of this was focused on how can we reduce our upfront capital costs in that initial software acquisition or purchase. And there was certainly an ongoing maintenance cost of 15 or 20% annually that would go on into perpetuity. But in general, the big savings was always going to happen in that early upfront initial capital investment of buying the software licenses. In today's day and age, however, in the movement to the cloud, the stakes are even higher. The only difference now is instead of focusing on reducing or negotiating an upfront capital cost, we're negotiating an ongoing higher level of operating expenditure or OPEX cost. So those costs are higher on an annual basis, might be cheaper in the short term in the first year because we're not having the big capital outlay, so that initial cost is lower. But long term, that cost will be higher. And I know a lot of vendors disagree with that, and they'll argue with me till the end on whether or not that's a true statement. But we see it time and time again. Companies that engage in a software subscription type of contract generally are going to pay more in the long term than if they were negotiating an upfront on-premise capital type of contract. And the reason again is because that ongoing cost goes on forever, and it's a higher annual cost, but it never stops. And in fact, in many cases, you'll have some escalators and things that kick in that will cause that number to increase significantly over time. And so that's why the stakes are so high with negotiations today, even higher than they have been in the past in the old world of on-prem. And today's cloud environment, that negotiation process is even more important than it's been in the past. So the first step in defining your negotiation strategy and actually executing that negotiation strategy is to understand what kind of leverage you have as an organization relative to the vendor or system integrator or reseller that you're negotiating with. Now, it's important that you negotiate the best deal possible for yourself, but you also want to recognize where your points of leverage are. And just to give you some examples of the types of things that might give you a leg up or give you additional leverage than what other companies might achieve are going to be things like the number of users you have, the number of employees. So in other words, if you're buying a big purchase, if it's a lot of licensees and a lot of people that are going to be using the software, that's going to equate to more subscription fees for your vendor, which means you probably have more leverage than a company that has a lot less in terms of number of users or potential subscription fees. Another thing to think about is how well known is your company. If you're a marquee name that people know, a household name, even if you're not that big of a company, but you're a household name that people recognize, vendors will typically bend over backwards and fight hard to get your business because they want that logo, they want that experience base on their list of clients and customers using their software. So be sure you recognize and leverage either your name recognition to consumers, or in certain industries, you may just be a very well-known player that could be an entry point into that industry for that vendor. Those are the types of things you have to think about, is what are the advantages that you bring to the table in addition to a checkbook that's willing to pay for software? What other advantages can you bring that might help you, give you leverage in negotiating a better deal for your organization? The other thing to think about is what kind of vendor are you negotiating with? Are you negotiating with SAP or Oracle, or are you negotiating with Accenture or Deloitte, Capgemini, one of those really big players? If you're a smaller organization that's not very big, you're not going to have a whole lot of leverage in that case. But if you're negotiating with a tier 3 industry player or a smaller niche-focused consulting or system integrator organization, you're probably going to have a bit more leverage than you would if you're negotiating with one of the big guys. So in addition to looking at yourself and what kind of leverage you have, it's also important to look at what is the leverage or negotiation position of the person you're negotiating with. Now, these are just a few things to think about. I've also included a link below to a complete article that outlines some of these things in more detail. So feel free to check out that link and look at the article to see some of the additional points of leverage you might consider. So once we have an assessment or an inventory of what our negotiation leverage is, we kind of know what cards we've been dealt in terms of how we could push on our vendor or vendors to negotiate a favorable deal. Now we need to figure out how are we going to actually negotiate our subscription licenses. And that's usually the first thing we negotiate is the software itself. And then the next thing we negotiate would typically be the services side. So let's start with the software itself and understand what we want to negotiate there. Before we even start to develop a strategy for our subscription negotiation process, it's important to recognize that we are most likely, if you're deploying a cloud-based solution, we are negotiating a cloud-based contract that goes on forever. Those costs will be with you forever. And that's a really important thing to understand and really take inventory or soak in that magnitude or the importance of that statement, which is what you're negotiating now is something you're going to have to live with for a long time, or at least until you decide to switch vendors, which will likely be a very painful process because you're talking about cloud solutions, data's in the cloud, your software is in the cloud. Typically those transitions from one cloud to another provider is going to be more difficult. So you want to make sure you get this right because we're going to have to live with it for a long time. So understand that first. Understand that this is something that has long-ranging consequences, much greater than, like I said before, those days of on-premise upfront capital expenditure costs. The other thing to recognize on the vendor side is that the incremental cost for a cloud-based provider to give you access to the software is very incremental. So in other words, the money they're charging you to have access to the software does not require additional R&D. It typically doesn't require creating something new for you because the cloud solution is being scaled across a number of different companies. So there are a number of levers that we can draw on or push on as it pertains to negotiating with our software provider. Some other things to think about in no particular order, just kind of a laundry list of things to think about as you negotiate your subscription licenses or your software contract. One is to negotiate not just what you need today, but negotiate for future purchases. So what are the additional licenses or modules you might need? And try to lock in the pricing of those additions as much as you can. You're not going to be able to predict the future and negotiate out 5, 10, 20 years, but you can at least cover the next couple of years as you grow and as you add licenses and modules. So be sure to negotiate not just for what you need today, but what you might need in the future. Another thing to think about is how do we get out of this contract? Make sure you understand what the termination clauses are. How do we exit? How do we get the data out of the system? What kind of support needs to be provided to help us get that data out of the system? So really just understanding what the exit clause looks like, because chances are fairly high that someday your organization is going to need to get out of the subscription-based cloud contract. And you'll probably have plenty of outs in terms of the notice you need to give to cancel the subscription license costs and the contract itself. But the tricky part is how do you make that transition to a new vendor or to a new product? So really understand that, because it may be after your time at the organization or it may be in the distant future, but we do want to understand how does our organization get out of this if they need to at any point in the future. A couple other things to keep in mind as well. One is to not overcommit. Make sure you're not overcommitting to shelfware and things that you don't need. A lot of times companies will get enticed by big discounts to buy more than they need, and they never end up using that software. And that's a big challenge, and that's something we commonly see, is that they'll buy too much, they end up with all the shelfware, and the cost of that incremental shelfware far exceeds the discount that was given to purchase it. So make sure you're not buying too much, you're not overcommitting. If anything, if you're not sure, err on the side of buying too little, but lock in the potential to buy those additional modules or functionality or licenses at some point in the future if you find that you need it. It's always easier to add it later than to try to back out of what you've already committed to. And then the last thing, speaking of discounts, is to be leery of those year-end or quarter-end or month-end discounts. Sales reps and vendors are notorious for pushing aggressively when it comes time for the end of a quarter, and especially the end of the year, largely because their commission is riding on it and they have numbers they have to hit. But having said that, although they do want your business and they very much want you to sign on the dotted line before the end of a period rather than after, they will most likely honor that same commitment in the future if that deadline comes and goes. Now, I've yet to see a vendor or a sales rep or anyone that has pulled the plug or pulled the deal away because the expiration date came and went. Typically, if they've offered you something, it was a steep discount to try and entice you to close a deal by the end of the quarter. Typically, they got approval from whoever they needed approval from to offer you that deal. Typically, if you come back after the fact and say, I'm ready to sign, but I'll only do it if I get that old deal, typically you're going to find that that deal has been honored. So don't be too pushed aggressively by that whole period end discount, because it is a very common sales tactic with very little upside, but a pretty significant downside. So once we've negotiated our software license agreement, now we need to think about the implementation itself and the system integrator technical resources that we're going to need to deploy the software in a way that's sustainable to our organization. And some things to think about as you negotiate. One is to focus on the one thing you can control with the system integrator when it comes to dollars and cents, and that's hourly rate. A lot of times companies want to focus on the total dollar amount. What is the total amount that we're going to spend on the system integrator? And you certainly need to know that, and you need to understand that from a budgetary perspective, but it's too easy to manipulate that number and manage assumptions in a way that help give you the answer you want to hear or help give you a lower number that may be unrealistic or unattainable to begin with. But the one thing we know we can control, and the one absolute in implementation, is the hourly rate we're paying for the different resources from our system integrator. So focus more on that hourly rate, get whatever discount you need to get at that hourly rate level. Then from a program management perspective and a project management perspective, manage the resources and the hours being billed on the project. And that's probably the best way to manage the total dollars, using that negotiated hourly rate. Otherwise, like I said, the system integrators will too often just narrow the scope or narrow down the bucket of hours to give you a number that you want to hear that sounds better to you. But in the reality is those numbers typically aren't realistic. But we do know that the hourly rate is something that's very real and something that will have a material impact on what your total cost ends up being. Some other things to think about are making sure that you have control and approval and ultimate right of refusal for any system integrator resources that are provided to your project. Make sure you have the right to replace the system integrator resources if they're not working out for you. You also want to make sure that you don't succumb to overly optimistic assumptions in a contract, in an implementation contract. For example, a lot of times companies will assume that your data is completely clean and it's just going to be transitioned over a weekend right before go live. It's typically not the case for most organizations, but that data assumption can have big implications on what the real cost ends up being, even though they've used an assumption that assumes perfect case or perfect world scenarios that make the number look smaller than it's really going to be. So we want to make sure that we have that clear understanding of those assumptions and that we have accurate assumptions going in. In some cases, it may be that we need to fix those assumptions and it causes the number to actually go up. And that's the irony of negotiating, is not only are we trying to get the number to go down, but in some cases we need to draw out the flawed assumptions and the problems with the way a implementation SOW or contract has been scoped so that it's more realistic, and that might actually inflate the numbers. But it's better to get that out now during the negotiation process rather than find out halfway through the project that those assumptions were never correct to begin with. And then finally, one other point I can provide here when negotiating with your system integrator is make sure that you look for those missing work streams, the things that need to be done to make your project successful, but they're not included in your contract. And it may not be that you're going to negotiate for the system integrator to do that work, or it may be that you are going to ask them to do it, but it's going to cause that number to go up, but at least you know you've got it covered in your statement of work. Oftentimes what we see companies do is they'll hire independent third parties to do the things that system integrators aren't good at. So things like master data management or organizational change management, they'll hire companies like Third Stage or other third parties to do that type of work, which again adds to the cost of your overall implementation, but that's because the initial number you were given was never realistic to begin with. So part of the negotiation process, again, is not just getting the cost to go down, but to ensure that we have a realistic cost and a realistic understanding of what the numbers are. So negotiation is part art, it's part science, it's part intended to get the best rate and cost that you can, but it's also meant to open up your eyes and make sure you have a full vision and understanding of what it is you're signing off on with these projects. Now, one of the risks with the negotiation process is that oftentimes vendors and system integrators will try to get you to not negotiate or to not bring in outside help, independent third parties to help you negotiate with them. They'll instead say, hey, instead of hiring a third party to help you negotiate and to represent your interest, why don't we just give you a bigger discount for you to sign right now and just bypass that whole process? And part of the reason they do that is because they know that just the idea of you bringing in an independent third party who is not aligned with their interest, that puts a certain amount of risk that the deal ends up getting done or not for them. And so there's a lack of clarity and suddenly there's more uncertainty around whether or not they'll get the deal. So they're usually willing to give you somewhat of a discount to avoid that process. What I would say in those cases is that you still want to do it. It's very important to make sure you have that outside perspective and that independent, objective support of you as an organization, because you don't want to overlook the things that you don't know, the cost savings you could be realizing or the assumptions that are flawed or the things that you know you need to have worked into your contract to protect you in the future. So make sure you don't preempt the process. One of the other things that we commonly see system integrators do to preempt the negotiation process is it's a process that they engage in called alignment. So they'll focus on aligning with you and making sure that we as a team, we the system integrator and you the implementing organization, we just need to get aligned and we need to align on what these costs should be and we need to align on our contracts. And that's a way to ensure that you're aligning with them rather than having you bring in someone who's going to challenge them or ask the tough questions as it relates to their contract. So make sure that you don't fall into the trap of just simply aligning with the system integrators, because oftentimes they're trained to do that. They're trained to focus on alignment and preempting that whole negotiation process. So one of the last things we can recommend is that in addition to leveraging an independent third-party digital transformation consulting firm like Third Stage, is to also engage an attorney that specializes in ERP and system integrator contracts. Now, you may have your own internal legal counsel, you may have your own external legal counsel that you lean on, and you certainly want to lean on them as well, but typically, unless they are focused exclusively on this type of work, they don't know the substance of what there is to negotiate. They may be negotiating T's and C's or terms and conditions from a general perspective, a general legal perspective, but it's very helpful, extremely helpful to have an attorney that really understands these contracts, that does this every day for a living, and that focuses on and specializes in negotiating software licensees as well as system integrator and consulting costs. And if you're looking for a recommendation on that, there's an attorney in particular that's very good at this, that specializes in it. I'm happy to pass along his name and information. Just feel free to contact me using my contact information below. I'd be happy to share his information with you. But regardless of whether it's him or someone else, make sure you leverage that outside help, that outside legal counsel that can ensure that your interests are reflected in the terms and conditions and that you're mitigating risk from a legal perspective. So to summarize everything we've talked about here so far, you don't want to shortchange the negotiation process. It's very important. It has long-lasting cost implications, long-lasting contractual and legal implications, and it also has long-lasting risk implications too, which we haven't even talked about that. There's a lot of non-financial and non-legal risks that are related to just the overall success of your implementation that pivot on you negotiating a contract and statement of work that makes the most sense for your organization. So I hope you found this information useful. I encourage you to download additional resources we have below. I also encourage you to reach out to me if you've got questions on anything we talked about here. I'm happy to dive into any of this content in a little bit more detail, or just be a sounding board for you as you negotiate your contracts and embark on your digital transformation journey. I also encourage you to please like this video if you like it. Please provide any comments you have below, any experiences you've had, and please subscribe to my channel as well. Hope you have a great day. We'll chat with you soon. Take care.